thank you for coming, and I'm looking forward to hearing and kind of learning about your experiences and your perspectives on this topic. So the reason why I'm interested in this topic is that very little was known in the 2000s about the sector as a whole. That faith-based alcohol treatment, whilst being a historical kind of constitution, very little was known about how many groups there were, what was their approach. And as I was growing up, I grew up in an evangelical subculture. I used to kind of come across these books which were very celebratory about personal testimonies, kind of celebrating the before and after, like narratives of salvation, of redemption, kind of how these sort of frames shaped people's, the way they talked about their recovery experience. And I was really interested in, okay, what's it like as an experience in rehabs, in treatment, in recovery itself? Because often kind of retrospective narratives of testimonies kind of conceal that. And the reason I was interested in that kind of that experience focus is that from kind of a secular perspective, there's a lot of suspicion of faith groups in the sector as being kind of amateurs, or worse, like preying on vulnerable people for converts. And these sort of frames are well-founded. Like if we think more globally, a wider set of political, economic kind of processes have created these conditions for spiritual coercion and abuse. So if we look to the US, particular evangelical rehabs such as Teen Challenge has been known for spiritual abuse, and they continue to receive federal funding and substantive financial support from the Christian right. And a lot of academics have framed this activity of evangelical rehabs as serving this underbelly on the war on drugs since the 80s, and kind of part and parcel of the carceral industrial complex, the prison industrial complex, where people are given a choice. You either go to jail or to go to rehab. And when we look to Guatemala, you have particular theologies of deliverance, of the demonic, of possession, which enable very illiberal and punitive interventions. And Kevin O'Neill's done a lot of work in Guatemala City, like documenting how people are put in straitjackets as part of a detox, and rolled up in carpets as part of the detox process. So kind of physical and religious forms of abuse. And there's similar sort of stories in Russia, where there is an unregulated sector of rehabs, where there's been several cases of forced detention, mistreatment, even mortality, leading to the state kind of closing one of the major charities down. So if that was the context, we wanted to investigate kind of what is the sector in the UK, kind of what is its composition, who's doing this work, what are the main experiences of service users within the sector, and to really document the different ways in which faith is positioned as part of the treatment program. How is it talked about? How is it positioned as kind of a necessary requirement, or as something which is just flavouring the motivation of staff, to use two poles? And as a study, kind of this latest study built on doctoral research. So during my PhD, I spent 2 months living and working in 2 rehabs. One of them was a evangelical Pentecostal kind of therapeutic community, working with people with addictions. This project was a more extensive study, kind of mapping the sector, doing surveys, interviews with key stakeholders. Then we had 5 case studies in which we did interviews and participant observation, where our researcher, Dan Webb, kind of went and kind of stayed and interviewed in these organizations. The whole report, as well as today's talk, the organization, their own identity is protected to protect the people that spoke to us. So as a sector, the main message I want to emphasize is that it defies generalization. We cannot talk about a singular faith-based drug and alcohol treatment sector. It's very diverse. There's very different approaches. On one side, you have harm reduction, you have abstinence, but even within those kind of often considered as poles, you have lots of different ethics of care, lots of different theologies of addiction. And what I was really surprised by is just the sheer number of these groups. So it's 135 organizations, 66 residential alcohol treatment centres alone. And the vast majority of these take a professionalised approach, kind of working closely with kind of joined up government, local authorities, offer a range of kind of person-centred care, a range of harm reduction, abstinence-based programmes, and are very careful very kind of careful with the ways in which religion kind of enters the programme or is experienced by clients. So they try to eschew any danger where religion becomes a barrier to service access or a barrier to treatment. And as a report, like, we want to emphasize the variegated experiences of recovery, so both the positive as well as the negative. And many people talked about in the more evangelical rehabs, the kind of the communal fellowship of worship, the emotional experiences during singing. And within other groups, kind of a more multi-faith setting, clients were talking about how meditation and prayer gives kind of a presence of silence and kind of quiets people's thoughts. And at a Kimberley House, one of the organisations working quite closely with government, with the participants is kind of addressing some of the criticisms made towards faith-based programmes, saying that it's swapping one addiction for another. This is where Cameron says, people say being into spiritual things is like a crutch. It's a cross addiction. But so is eating chocolate. If God keeps me clean and can live a good life, I'd rather believe in God. So when I was hearing these quotes, and I've heard these quotes for a long time, I was chatting with some of my friends, my brother, and there's often a narrative within the sector of the ends justify the means. The ends of recovery justify the method. And I was quite perturbed by the fact that 34% of these alcohol treatment providers in the faith sector make religious participation compulsory. And when we think about the residential faith-based rehabs, it's over half make religion compulsory. And within this, very few of the organisations are regulated. 11% are registered with the National Drug Treatment Monitoring System. Only 9% are registered with the Care Quality Commission. So this kind of evidences the fact that medical and having medical staff on site in these rehabs, they're absent from these organisations, because to be registered with the Care Quality Commission, you only register if you need to have if you have nurses and medical staff on site. And what I was really worried about was a lot of these organisations had quite an ambivalent view towards medication of antidepressants and other forms of psychoactive medication. And just under 10% prohibited the use of prescribed medication from doctors, insisting on a pure spiritual model of addiction. So one of the main arguments which we've been making in the report and in other academic work is that when people enter these programs, like, is it out of their own free choice? And what we've seen over the last 10 years is a mixture of budget cuts, resource rationing by local authorities, kind of depleted choices amongst treatment providers, and a de-skilling of the workforce across the sector. This has led to faith groups becoming more prominent options for service providers, for service commissioners as well as service users. And on one side, this is a product of the last 10 years of austerity, where £162 million was cut from local authority budgets in England alone. And inpatient detox support has been cut over 50% since 2011. And there's been a significant drop in the number of residential rehabs available. And local authority commissioned drug and alcohol services, they have to compete for very depleted funds, and it's very hard to secure sufficient resources when you have these long-standing constructions of the service user as, the addict. It's a very stigmatized notion of the undeserving. Kind of, we should be spending money on the more deserving causes. So that's on one side, but when we kind of map this, it's a regressive distribution. So the cuts to public health budgets and funding for drug and alcohol services have hit the most deprived communities the hardest. And this is also compounding kind of issues where drug and alcohol related deaths is the highest. So I've got some figures on the slides there, where drug and alcohol services in the 10 most deprived local authorities have experienced a real terms cut of 32% compared to an 8% cut in the least deprived local authorities. And this is leading to kind of obvious concerns around service availability, the lack of what were specialist and culturally appropriate services, so particular services for Black, Asian, minority ethnic populations, kind of they have been mainstreamed and kind of hit the hardest by this service rationalization. So when it comes back to the faith sector, kind of what we've seen in the last 5 years is a shift in focus towards the criminal justice, and so the use of probation-related referrals to rehabs, and we're going to be seeing a lot more of that over the next 5 years, with the last announcement of funding, where we have these kind of notions of compulsory sobriety and kind of the use of kind of the criminal justice system as a way of kind of coercing people into treatment. So in this context of austerity and criminal justice, the distinction between what is considered mandatory and voluntary engagement in these faith-based programs is becoming blurred. And what I want to suggest and help us reflect on is how is this created a propensity for spiritual abuse. And spiritual abuse, what I mean by that, drawn upon Lisa Oakley's work, is an ongoing systematic pattern of coercive control within a religious context. And for me, this raises the question about the ethics of religious conversion in welfare, particularly for individuals whose mobility, whose movement is limited, restricted, or otherwise dependent on another party. And this is the organization which I spent 2 months in back in 2010. And this is kind of a very kind of upfront critique of their program. So you'd get up at 7, you'd have quiet time, breakfast, you'd work in landscaping or doing up furniture for 8 hours, then you come back, dinner, prayer and worship, and then an hour free time. You'd have separation from your family and loved ones. You'd give up access to money and mobile phones. There'd be a total submission to the leader and modeling the example of older residents. But also there was non-medicated detox, and particularly for people in long-term alcohol dependency, this is a high risk. And whilst they're open about the fact that it's non-medicated, I was finding evidence that people on entry weren't told about these risks. So they weren't really adhering to the NICE guidelines. And then there was a kind of a ban on kind of opiate-based and psychoactive medication, including antidepressants. So this means that kind of mental health, kind of mental ill health and mental health conditions may go untreated, or worse, become undiagnosed or misunderstood as a Jezebel spirit. And within all of this, kind of faith in Christ was seen as a positive replacement for addiction. And the evidence which I'll be presenting next is kind of giving weight to this idea that when faith is elevated as this panacea, this fix-all, which can fix mental health problems, which can fix addiction, there's a real issue here of codependency, where the residents become institutionalized and dependent upon this religious lifestyle and trapped within that regimented structure of community. There's also cases of bullying and emotional coercion in the form of the denial of medication and obliged and expected behavior in worship. So what I'm trying to say is that the espoused ethos, what is said, what's talked about of the service providers, kind of they may say that it's welcome to all, that's optional, it's non-discriminatory, but there's a big gap between what is espoused by the service providers and the day-to-day, the operative ethos, as well as what is experienced by the residents themselves. So Silo and Pool, this is one of the organizations which said it was open to all, optional, non-discriminatory. And here, kind of there were very direct kind of encouragements to kind of work the program, and the program is kind of geared towards conversion. And David Street, one of the residents, is quite open, like you either conform or you leave. And after trying lots of other like NHS and private rehabs, some of these organizations are very expensive, like £800 a week for some of the residential rehabs. A lot of these organizations are free, and they're the last chance. You've kind of used up all your social capital and trust of your family, and there is this kind of emotional kind of compulsion to work the program, whatever that program is. And here's just a quote from Phil from back in 2010, who just really kind of nails this dilemma of to stay or leave. Just saying, I want out. I miss having freedom. I miss my kids. Kind of the worship here, it's a performance. I've tried to do it half-heartedly, but I feel hypocritical. Like, why am I doing this? Is it to get everyone to accept me? He talks about not minding the teaching, but gets kind of very disconnected when one of the leaders stands up and kind of encourages him to stand in a particular way and engage the program in a particular way. And Phil kind of concludes they have a very limited view of success. You have to be saved. Until then, they'll just keep saying, like, keep going. You're not ready to leave yet. 6 months, 8 months. It's all out of love and best interest at heart. They've seen thousands of people come and go, many die. Maybe then they're right. So this is kind of some of the in the situ experiences which people are living through in some of these organizations. And where we come to notions of voluntary engagement, a lot of these are blurred. So Martin, in the quote above, talks about how there's some people here not wanting to be there. They're only in this faith-based rehab because it's a condition of a parole license, or they've exhausted the bank of mum and dad. They have to They have to kind of prove themselves to regain the faith of their parents. And when taken in the context of austerity, the lack of alternative options available to service users means that there are social, legal, as well as material incentives to work the program. And if you leave, many of the programs are kind of on the sticks in rural areas, and kind of leaving the program is quite kind of difficult. So you stick out here, really, Keith explains. We're in between two sides of the motorways in the middle of nowhere. There's no shops for miles. Who wants to do that to themselves? And I'm not saying that these programs are like a Jesus gulag or a total institution. What I'm trying to say is we need to take seriously the ambivalent ethics of care when it comes to religious conversion. So David talks about his conversion experience in this quote, and shares kind of all these encouragements to work the program. It does raise questions about the notions of free choice and kind of agency when it comes to conversion decisions. So David kind of talks about kind of the painful experience when he first started of feeling disconnected from worship. He's just going through the procedure through loyalty to his wife. And when he was in that particular place of feeling disconnected, it exacerbated his anxiety. It made him feel really uncomfortable, like there was an expectation to be a certain way. And after 2 or 3 weeks, he was reading Life by the Spirit, and he had a total revelation. And then he recounts this emotional experience of jumping off the chair and bouncing around the walls for weeks, because he realized that Jesus did walk this earth, Jesus did die, Jesus was resurrected. And the last bit of this quote for me is the most significant, because it talks about this kind of process of conversion as an intravenous drip to get hydrated. It's like I was drip fed the word of God, and on that particular day it washed over me. So if we take nothing from this talk, what I want us to reflect upon is that when we think about the ethics of religious conversion, what we need to do is move beyond just thinking about the intentions of the service provider, the caregiver, and instead think through these more awkward and subtle forms of power at work in the rehabs and welfare spaces more generally. So the forms of power which work through social obligation of needing to fit in, social incentives, kind of the pressure to kind of maintain kind of good relationships with spouses and family, as well as the kind of the regimented encouragement and restricted mobility which people experience in many of these rehabs. And more recently, this is the only organisation which I haven't anonymised because it's in the public domain. The Voice Wales publicised a article about Victory Outreach UK in Wales of just documenting forms of spiritual abuse where religion is used to both legitimize unpaid labor. And the quotes from Ross and Lee here just really emphasize the kind of the lived experience of if they didn't work, they said you get kicked out. And he told us that Sundays are the only day you have off, and that was only to make time for worship. And then Lee recounts his experience. If you don't work, you pack your bags and piss off. We were told, if you didn't like it, you can leave. But Richard knew that some of these staff, like myself, had nobody, no family, nowhere to go. We didn't have a choice. So these are some of the dilemmas which I wanted to kind of foreground between agency and compulsion and religious conversion. To end, I just want to dig a little bit deeper about this idea of faith as a panacea, as a fix-all, a silver bullet. And in many of the organizations we've worked with, they've had experiences of other evangelical rehabs, which were kind of talked about as a bit culty. I wouldn't send anyone there. It's hardcore. Like working every day, you have to give up all your benefit money. They made me cut off my hair, no counseling, just you and God. That may work for some people, but for people with mental health problems, they need treatment. And Ant from the Sanctuary kind of talks about a similar experience of Hebron. It wasn't the religion, it was the fact they denied medication. No paracetamols for your leg ache, no Buscopan for your stomach aches. It's the thought that prayer would fix everything, and they wouldn't even let you smoke. And I cannot do everything at once. You've got to do it gradually in stages, otherwise you'll just fail. And that's exactly what I did. I ran out the door. I couldn't do it. And I want to emphasize this is a particular subset of service providers, not representative of the whole sector. But within these particular groups, addiction is understood as a spiritual void and recovery as some form of divine deliverance. And what I have a problem with this is that it produces stigma, these narratives of the sinful self and the restored self. They continuously produce kind of a sense of a stigmatized identity and reaffirm that. And this taps into kind of why many practitioners and people in recovery find the language of addict really problematic. But when it comes into the religious context, in these particular groups, non-abstinence failure, relapse, wasn't taken to be a failure of the program, it was individualized. It was the failure of the individual to submit to God's will. And when people did relapse, it was, they talked all the talk, but they weren't walking the walk. And this is a particular strategy to protect kind of and elevate the superiority of religious conversion as a pathway to recovery, as it allows staff to both discount and outsource that failure onto the individual who's not worked the program sufficiently. But within the community, amongst other residents, it prompts this continual questioning about their own kind of their own recovery journey. How sincere are they in their own faith commitment? And I think there is what I find problematic here is this language of failure and relapse, and how do we kind of create spaces which avert, kind of add in kind of shame to kind of people's experiences of dependency, of substance use, of relapse. So kind of protecting and meeting people where they're at, rather than kind of putting the foot in when people have relapsed effectively. And in Hebron, kind of religious narratives were used to put the foot in. That's how I see it. So Liam was speaking to a new resident, Carl, who'd made a faith commitment several years ago, but he was really anxiously asking, like an anxious loop, am I still a Christian after relapsing? And the response was, it was your choice to go back on drugs. You turned your back on Jesus and all what he's done for you. Once you realize what God has done for you deep down, you wouldn't want to go back to drink or drugs. Christ gives freedom. So as a way of concluding, the report is still available. There's lots of recommendations for policy and practice in the executive summary. What I want to reflect on is the need for greater transparency, training and monitoring in the sector, as well as just raise a kind of a big kind of red flag that faith-based service providers are becoming more closely tied to the criminal justice and recovery agendas, and that may create and exacerbate these unethical forms of religious practice and kind of experiences of religious conversion. And I think we need to take greater care and respect to the agency of service users, especially understanding the way in which people may be coming to these organizations not out of free choice. And if I have time during questions, I would like to talk a little bit more about how do we start to develop theologies or philosophies from the margins of thinking about harm reduction, not just as a public health intervention to cut down the risk to the individual or to society, but shift in the way in which we think about harm reduction to focus on how risk and harm are byproducts of existing social, political, economic inequalities, such as the criminalization and the stigmatization of users, and how repressive drug laws tend to be kind of very racialized in their policing, and how the figure of the user is often kind of used to enable very illiberal and punitive interventions. And as recovery communities, as people of faith and goodwill, I think this is one of the ways in which theology can be a lot more radical in calling out that the wider systems and powers which produce harm and produce kind of stigmatized experiences. So I will stop there.